This video is an introduction to this moss-based Bonemeal farm, which I call the Stonemeal Farm V7M8, as well as brief instructions for building it. This world download here is quite thorough though, so I won't give a full block-by-block tutorial. I'll begin by listing the practical properties of this farm. It gets 13.7 thousand bone meal profit per hour. It does need to be chunk aligned, and it can be tiled across neighboring chunks, but it does slightly poke out into a few blocks in neighboring chunks. Of course, when you build neighboring copies of this, those slabs just overlap with slabs on the other side, so it's perfectly fine. So the full bounding blocks, including the floor, which I do sort of prefer to count the floor, it's 17 by 20 by 17. But if we just look at the core redstone, that's in a volume of 15 by 19 by 15 blocks. It cannot be stacked vertically, not any further than this anyway, due to some game mechanics that I'll mention later. And it is also slightly directional. When this side of the farm with the output and the on switch, when that's facing north, you get the full like 13.7 thousand per hour, but when it's facing south, it seems to get only 13.2 thousand. To avoid that loss, I'd recommend building it with this front side pointing north. And the last overview thing that I want to mention is that I am certain this is not the best bone meal farm out there. These stone generators I'm using are relatively slow, and the main advantages here are just that it fits in basically one chunk, and it's light enough on lag that it can run on my iPad without generating enough lag to actually slow down the game. And it's faster than the one or two bone meal farms that I've built in my survival world before. So, in other words, it's good enough for me, and I'm making this video because there's a chance it's also good enough for others, and it's fine if it's not. I'm still going to use it myself. Now then, let's cover some technical details. This farm is heavily based off of Zolson012's design. It sort of shows in the overall piston layout and some of the internals here. But Zolson's design broke in 1.20.40. The issue is these stone generators. There are several possible timings that work. Lava attempts to flow 30 game ticks or 1.5 seconds after it receives a block update. Incidentally, it uses what are called pending ticks to schedule that flow, and Bedrock Edition only executes up to 100 pending ticks per chunk per game tick, meaning that you can't generally stack vertically moss-based bone meal farms like this, because they would end up using too many pending ticks per chunk. Here, 2 layers works of like the smaller module, but I tried 3 or 4 and I could not get it to work. When there's too many pending ticks, the stone generators can end up outputting cobblestone instead, which breaks the farm. Anyway, we can actually stack these pending ticks, updating lava faster than once every 1.5 seconds, and getting it to flow faster and produce more stone. Zolson's farm used a 12 game tick cycle, which seems to be slightly unreliable, and 1.20.40 fixed a bug which had stopped that unreliability from actually letting cobblestone be generated. Now that that bug is gone, that 12 game tick timing no longer works for boss farms as far as I'm aware. There were also some like observers that ran past lava in Zolson's design, so that could also be the issue. Maybe it's both, maybe it's just one of those. There are also stone generators that run on 8 game tick and 20 game tick cycles. Here I'm using 2 layers, each on 20 game tick cycles, with an offset of half a second or 10 game ticks between the layers. This results in moss being spread and collected effectively every 5 redstone ticks instead of every 6 redstone ticks in Zolson's design, which gives an expected naive rate increase of 20%. In my testing, I actually managed to get 23% better rates than, with this Stonemeal farm than Zolson's posted rates. Unfortunately, it seems that this design is quite a bit more than 20% laggier than Zolson's design, but I am running this on an iPad, so my tests were quite janky. I just ran 3 copies of the farm, compared in-game time to IRL time and divide it by the number of copies to try to estimate how much each copy of the farm contributed to MSPT, which is the milliseconds per tick that the game spends calculating what's going on in the world. From that effort, at least on my device, it seems that the Stonemeal farm is around 50% laggier than Zolson's was. Besides changing the timing from Zolson's farm, I also moved out some of the stone generators back by a block horizontally. This makes some of the wiring a little bit easier. I mentioned that Zolson's had some like observers running past lava, so we don't need to do that because we've moved it back by a block. And that's basically what I did with the piston layout and timings. Next, let's cover the rates and some leaks. I'm not sure exactly how long I've tested this farm in total, but from at least a dozen hours of testing, I can say that the Stonemeal Farm V7M8 Mark 8 in this north-facing direction gets at least 13.7 thousand Bonemeal profit per hour, and probably more like 13.75 thousand, but it's better to understate it. There are also several places where moss items can leak out. The easiest to fix if I wanted to would be the roof, so let's start with that. Out of superstition and hope that these do something, I've added some upper half slabs to try to reduce the number of moss items that manage to glitch to the top. But really the solution here is to poke a hole in the roof, add some extra blocks around the rim, and then add water streams that push anything that manages to get up here back into the farm. The hardest places to fix will probably be these. As you can see, moss items can glitch into the wiring areas, and there's not much I think I can do about that. Lastly, there is this area. At first, you might think that this is the same roof problem as before, but I'm pretty sure it's actually coming from here. As you can see in this screenshot, moss items can end up clipped into that piston. Sometimes that means that they just sit there, unable to be pushed by the piston that they're clipped into, and out of reach of other pistons. Alternatively, it seems that they can just get ejected from the farm backwards. This seems possible to mitigate, maybe by adding some extra water streams, so I apologize for being a bit lazy with that and the roof, since I didn't want to harm the aesthetic of the build, which is a little bit of a silly thing to worry about, but I'm pretty sure the leaks are a minor impact on the rates either way. Finally, let's jump into build instructions. First, find a chunk that you want to build the farm in. Lots of ways to find chunks, doesn't really matter how you do it. Then find the 4 central blocks of this chunk, and then you can choose any one of these 4. I happen to choose this one for these examples, but you can choose any one of these 4. Then find north, the negative Z direction, and with that, you've already got the positioning and orientation of the farm all figured out, since, as far as I know, the vertical height of this farm should not matter. In theory, it can with sub-chunk alignment, but I didn't find anything that seemed to indicate that sub-chunk alignment mattered for this farm. The world download goes layer by layer from there, and I also have these chests showing how many resources you should have left at each step. There's also some extra signs and just like little help like this, so it should be pretty thorough. The materials list and the meanings of my block palette are also in the video description. There's one additional optional step, which is input protection. The way that the normal clock over here works is that once you turn it on, you can turn it off at any time, and the clock will just immediately stop outputting, and that's not an issue. If there was going to be a clock pulse happening and it doesn't happen, yeah, no harm. However, if shortly after you turn the farm off and then back on with the right timing, you can send an extra pulse through the system, which would risk generating cobblestone in some of the stone generators and therefore break the farm. In other words, this is safe for normal usage. If you don't spam the lever, you're perfectly fine, and if the farm doesn't crash, of course. That's the conditions. So it isn't spam proof though. This additional module over here completely deals with the spamming issue with this extra little comparator loop, and it also has this system of observers to deal with if this area gets unloaded and reloaded. If, whether due to forgetfulness with leaving the farm running or just unluckiness with the game crashing, if this farm gets unloaded and then you load this area back in, this observer looking at this item frame will send out a pulse when that happens, which will shut off the farm. And then, of course, this extra observer is just so that when you actually want to turn on the farm or whatever, it turns off that safety mechanism and the farm actually runs. Even with this input protection, it should still be possible for a little bit of cobblestone to generate in here, I think anyway. So if this area does get reloaded while the farm is running, you should probably go through and check for cobblestone. It's a pain, but there's not much that I can do about that. Alright, if you've made it this far into the video, you seem to have liked the design, so be sure to like the video. I'll also be slowly releasing some videos on some other interesting farms that I've designed, so consider subscribing. That said, I care less about my own channel than about the design or world download being spread. It's relatively useless if nobody uses it after all. Now then, the serious part of the video is over, so I want to explain the name of the farm. While designing it, I started to realize that the hardest part of moss-based Bonemeal farms is designing the stone generators. These farms almost feel like a complicated array of stone generators that happen to convert the stone into Bonemeal afterwards, thus the name of the farm. As for the versioning numbers, Stonemeal Farm version 7, Mark 8. The first few versions were, in retrospect, me just flailing around before actually knowing the relevant, or all the relevant game mechanics. But at least the variants of version 7 from Mark 1 to Mark 8, at that point I knew what I was doing, and I was just trying to finalize and make slight improvements to the design. I was actually halfway through making the world download for version 7 Mark 6, when I figured out that I could make it slightly better. I just couldn't let that sit, so then, yeah, I did. There's also an attempted version 8 Mark 1 somewhere in this area, but it was bad, so I went back to version 7, and hopefully version 7 Mark 8 is the final version. I hope that at least a few people can get some use out of this. And with that, goodbye.